Dipama. Chapter 3. Unshakeable Peace. Quote, I am perfectly at peace now. Whatever comes, I will embrace. In 1967, the Burmese government ordered all foreigners, including Indian émigrés, to leave the country. Dipama was in a quandary about whether to stay or go. The monks assured her that she could get special permission to remain in Rangoon as a teacher, and that her daughter could also remain in the country. That was an unprecedented honor for a foreigner, much less a woman and a single mother. She reflected on the possibility of staying, but the political situation, especially in Rangoon, grew worse. Her concern for the quality of Dipa's education finally convinced her that it was time to leave. In India, she decided, Dipa could reconnect with her roots and also pursue higher education in her native Bengali. They moved to a relative's house in the suburbs of Calcutta, now Kolkata. In her new surroundings, Dipama missed the company of like-minded people. She invited neighborhood women to practice meditation, but they were not interested. After a year, mother and daughter moved to a tiny apartment in an old building above a metal grinding shop in the center of the old quarter of Calcutta. It had a closet-sized kitchen, 3 by 6 feet, with one charcoal burner on the floor, no running water. Water had to be carried up 4 flights of stairs, and a communal toilet for several families. Dipama slept on a thin straw mat. Although Dipa was attending university on government grants, they had no income and got by on the goodwill offerings of family members. Eventually, word spread through the Bengali community that an accomplished meditation teacher, one who could, quote, bring results, had arrived from Burma. Although many families observed Buddhist rituals, meditation was still foreign to the average layperson. Dipama offered something new and different, an actual spiritual practice. One by one, Calcutta housewives began to arrive at her doorstep. Presenting tough but effective lessons for people who wanted to meditate in the midst of busy lives as householders, Dipama taught her students to use every moment as an opportunity for practice. Mindfulness, she said, could be applied to every activity: speaking, ironing, cooking, shopping, caring for children. The whole path of mindfulness, she repeated tirelessly, is this: whatever you are doing, be aware of it. Dipama had so much faith in the power of practice amid the hubbub of home life that one admirer dubbed her, quote, the patron saint of householders. When asked about the difference between formal meditation practice and daily life, she adamantly insisted, you cannot separate meditation from life. Everything she asked of her students, Dipama did herself, and more. Adhering to the 5 precepts, sleeping only 4 hours a night, meditating many hours every day. Students were expected to report to her on their practice twice a week, and to undertake periods of self-guided retreat during the year. While most Calcuttans loved discussion and talk, Dipama was often silent, or spoke only a few simple phrases when she taught. Her students were able to take refuge in the silence and the unshakable peace that she provided. Quote, she was one of the few people in my life in whose presence I have gone quiet, one student recalled. I was able to rest in her silence, like resting under a large shade tree. End quote. The family's one-room apartment had to serve as a bedroom and living space for Dipama, her daughter, and later also for her daughter's son, Rishi. It was also a teaching space for the students, both Indians and Westerners, who began arriving. Sometimes Dipama's room would be so crammed with students that they had to stand outside in the hallway and on the balcony. With a continual stream of visitors from early morning until late at night, Dipama never refused anyone, no matter how tired she was. When her daughter urged her to take more time for herself, she insisted, quote, they are hungry for the Dharma, so let them come. Even ordained monks sought her guidance as a teacher. The Venerable Rashtrapala Mahathera, who by then had been a monk for 18 years, recalled that some disapproved of his choice of teachers, asking why, after completing a doctoral degree, he would practice meditation under a woman. Quote, "I don't know the way," he explained, "but she knows, so I will take help from her. I don't regard her as a woman. I think of her only as my teacher." He did a retreat under her guidance and experienced for himself what he'd only read about for 18 years. Dipa Ma gave him her blessing to teach, and 6 months later, in 1970, he established the first Insight Meditation Center in India, the well-known International Meditation Center in Bodh Gaya. Dipa Ma's daughter witnessed many transformations in the community of students. When students first started meditating, their behavior was full of restlessness, anger, gossip, and harsh speech. After some months of practice, such behaviors subsided. Male students who had killed fish and animals gradually gave up hunting because of Dipa Ma's influence. Jack Engler, who went to India in the mid-1970s to further his own meditation practice and to complete his doctoral research on Buddhist meditation, noted that even people living in proximity to Dipa Ma were affected by her presence. Beginning of long quote. When she first moved into her apartment complex, it was a pretty noisy and contentious place, with a lot of bickering, arguing, and yelling among the tenants, amplified by the open courtyard. Everyone knew everyone else's business because it was being shouted back and forth all the time. Within 6 months of her moving in, the whole place had quieted down, and people were starting to get along with each other for the first time. Her presence and the way she dealt with people, quietly, calmly, gently, treating them with kindness and respect, setting limits and challenging their behavior when necessary, but out of concern for everyone's welfare. Not out of anger or simple desire for her personal comfort. Set an example and made it impossible to carry on in the angry, contentious way they had before. It was the simple force of her presence. You couldn't act like that around her. You just didn't. End quote. Joseph Goldstein was the first American student to be introduced to Dipa Ma. In 1967, he had met Munindra while staying at the Burmese Meditation Center in Bodh Gaya. Munindra later told Joseph that he had someone special for him to meet and brought him to Dipa Ma. Their bond developed into a loving mother-son relationship until her death 20 years later. Joseph recalled one of his first visits to her apartment. Quote, "To get to her small rooms on the top floor, you had to go down a narrow dark hallway and then up many dark flights of stairs. But when you got to her rooms, they felt filled with light. The feeling was wonderful, and when I would leave, it was as if I was floating down the streets of Calcutta, floating through the dirt and crowds. It was a very magical and sacred experience." End quote. In the early 1970s, Joseph introduced his friend Sharon Salzberg to Dipa Ma. A similar long-lasting bond was formed. Dipa Ma adopted both Sharon and Joseph like her own children. Sharon recalls how Dipa Ma kept photo albums of all of them together. They would drink tea, look at the albums, and talk about Dharma. Sharon and Joseph both remembered Dipa Ma as, quote, "the most loving person I have ever met." Jack Cornfield, who met Dipa Ma in the late 1970s, recalls his first encounter with her. Quote, "I had been a monk for a while, and I was used to bowing to teachers, so I started to bow to her. I felt a little bit awkward. She wasn't a monk, she was a householder. But she just picked me up off the floor and gave me this great big bear hug, which is how she greeted me every time I saw her. It was wonderful. It was as if she was saying, none of this bowing stuff. I'm not the big teacher that we have to make a big deal about. Just a huge hug." End quote. Jack, Joseph, and Sharon, now all teaching in America, told their own students about Dipa Ma. Their students told others, who in turn told still others. Dipa Ma was a curious entity to Westerners. Physically, she was almost invisible. A frail, little elderly woman poking out of her white sari like, quote, "a little bug wrapped up in cotton," as one put it. Yet spiritually, she was a giant. Entering her presence felt like walking into a force field where magical things could happen. Perceptual changes, mind-to-mind communication, and spontaneous states of deep concentration. In 1980 and again in 1984, Joseph, Sharon, and Jack Cornfield invited Dipa Ma to teach during the annual 3-month retreat at Insight Meditation Society. Even though Dipa Ma was 69, in poor health, and uncomfortable with airplane travel, she agreed to make the long journey to America, bringing along her daughter, her toddler grandson, and a translator. The cultural gap for Dipa Ma was enormous. She was completely unfamiliar with the ordinary details of American daily life. For example, that water for bathing is dispensed from a shower, that dogs live inside and are fed from bowls, that cornflakes and milk are eaten with a spoon, that boxes on the street spit out money when you press buttons. Sharon Salzberg related this anecdote, beginning a long quote. Dipa Ma lived simply and didn't understand Western technology. The first time we brought her to the States, we were showing her grocery stores and this and that. We took her to what was then one of the first ATM machines, where you put in your card, punch in your code, and the money comes out. She's standing there outside the wall of the bank, and we do our whole thing, and she's just standing there shaking her head saying, "Oh, it's so sad, it's so sad." We said, "What's so sad?" And she said, "That poor person who has to sit inside that wall all day, no light and no air, and you stick in the card, and they read it, and they hand you your money." So we said, no, there is nobody in there. This is just this process that happens. And she said, that's like anatta, the absence of self. And we said, right. Then she began to elucidate, right in that moment, the teaching of anatta. Not only the absence of a core being somehow in control of this process, demanding that the body and the mind act according to its whim or will or wish, but also that great sense of interconnectedness, of transparency, of oneness that comes when we look deeply, deeply inside of ourselves. End quote. Although Dipa Ma's teaching experience had not included sitting on a platform tethered to a microphone in front of a large hall of students, she attempted to accommodate her American hosts. Unused to the cold weather of New England, she would arrive in the meditation hall, as one student remembers, quote, so wrapped up in coats and shawls that you didn't know who or what it was. She was fond of addressing her audience with the refrain, "You are all my Dharma children. I could not neglect your call to come here." While health problems prevented her return to the United States after the 1984 trip, Dipa Ma continued to teach from her Calcutta apartment until her death 5 years later. She died on the evening of September 1st, 1989, at the age of 78. Her death came unexpectedly. When Dipa returned from work that evening, her mother wasn't feeling well. Dipa asked if she should call a doctor. Dipa Ma hesitantly agreed, and their neighbor Sandeep Mutsudi went to find the doctor but couldn't locate him. When Sandeep returned, he sat down next to Dipa Ma and began to massage her arm. He recalled, quote, "Then Ma asked me to touch her head, so I touched her head, and I started chanting the sutras she taught me. When she heard me chanting, she bowed with her hands in prayer. She bowed towards the Buddha and did not get up. So we both lifted her off the floor and found that her breathing had stopped. She had died in her bow to the Buddha. Her face was very calm and at peace." End quote. Nearly 400 people attended Dipa Ma's funeral several days later. Her body lay on an open cot. One by one, students filed past, laying garlands on their teacher's body until she was completely covered with flowers. End of section.